Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Come on, one more time. Good afternoon. All right. There's an old campaign trick that to shake the rust off. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob, for having me here today. Thank you, everybody, for coming to stop in and listen to a very important topic. My name is Vinn White. I'm Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Secretary at USDOT. And today, I'll be speaking a little bit about federal programs, how we've adapted in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and for those of you who were stopping in to listen to structures and deficient bridges and things like that, like engineering stuff, I'm going to have to pull my other colleagues in for that. My perspective is going to be very much in the context of how federal programs have changed, how we approach and manage process when it comes to implementing new procedures related to rebuilding. So, as Bob said, I served as the Hurricane Sandy Task Force liaison. This was a group that was assembled by the president to manage the rebuilding and response in the wake of the hurricane in the Northeast. And so I kind of coordinated across modes to manage the response. And we'll get into a lot of that here in the details. But thank you again very much to invite me here today. I look forward to receiving your questions at the end. So with that, so here we have several pictures, federal program adaptation post-Sandy. We've got just widespread devastation. I know you all have seen these images time and again. Here we have sort of clockwise your New York City Transit employees pumping water out of the Cranberry Street Tunnel. We've also got damage to homes in Brooklyn, as well as the infamous roller coaster in the ocean picture from the boardwalk images in New Jersey. It's probably good to just kind of recap. It's hard to believe that 2 years ago this October is when the storm hit. And these are sort of like your big picture facts from that devastation. It's the deadliest, most destructive hurricane in the 2012 Atlantic hurricane season. You might look at that as a year and say, okay, well, there were 10 tropical storms and hurricanes. This was the worst. But I think that second bullet really says a lot, which is the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history. It was a Category 3 storm off of Cuba. And when it made landfall off the Atlantic, it was Category 2. But you all remember this image of sort of the Doppler image of 1,100-mile span off the Atlantic coast. And as of last summer, so you can imagine this number's probably only gone up in ways, $68 billion in damages to the region, and higher number only eclipsed by Hurricane Katrina. At least 286 people died across 7 countries. So DOT's response in the immediate aftermath of the storm, DOT deployed staff to the region, both at FEMA's coordination centers and the JFOs, the Joint Field Offices in New York and New Jersey. Altogether, 58 staff. I worked very closely with a lot of these folks. They literally put down their day jobs to go live out of suitcases and backpacks for as much as a month after. The initial impacts after the storm, $5.8 billion in the transit system, which is a number I know is probably low. $400 million to the highway system, that's your roads and bridges. Aviation system, $40 million. $70 million damage to Amtrak and freight. And $2 billion to the movement of product along the pipeline system. And here's another image that I'm sure you've seen. We're multimodal, but this is a boat on tracks is something you don't see every day. Most of you in the room know this and understand this, but I always try to cover this base for those, particularly those maybe watching on the webcast who aren't familiar. But DOT works in operating administrations or modes. These could be modes in the traditional sense, your transit, your highways, aviation, but then modes like PHMSA or Pipelines Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. We refer to that as a mode as well. The modal response here, highways has a program that releases emergency relief funding, quick release to impacted states. Federal motor carriers, Federal Rail Administration, they lifted hours of service regulations so that we could get trucks in place even ahead of the storm. Federal Aviation restored the air navigation system. Maritime, a lot of folks don't know this, but our Maritime Administration dispatched 2 ships from our Ready Reserve fleet. They essentially served as floating dormitories to almost 1,000 federal emergency response workers. The Pipelines Administration repairing gas distribution lines, and Federal Transit, which again was the most impacted, but in the immediate aftermath of the storm, working with FEMA and GSA to procure 250 buses. This gives you a little understanding of how we functioned, and both in the field and in headquarters. The 4 most impacted modes here, your aviation, transit, Federal Railroad, and highways, working both on the headquarters side and on the field side, working with the Office of Policy with the recovery and the mitigation leadership group, but they're both conjoined by the REDCO group, which is your emergency team at headquarters. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, certain groups would come out with their own reports. This is the New York State 2100 report was just one of a few that came up with recommendations. We see the bullets here, protecting, upgrading, and strengthening your existing system, rebuilding smarter, replacing with better options and alternatives, encouraging the use of green and natural infrastructure. But the most important, and one that you'll see as a theme here, is the last one, creating new incentive programs to encourage resilient behaviors and reduce vulnerabilities. As I mentioned before, the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force was assembled. It was formalized through an executive order by President Obama in December of 2012, comprised of 14 agencies, 9 White House offices, and it was led by Housing and Urban Development Secretary Sean Donovan. This group functioned within what's called the Natural Disaster Recovery Framework, the NDRF. The NDRF, some may know, was born out of Hurricane Katrina, and it assembles best practices, process, protocol, procedures, but it's a living framework because there's a recognition that this isn't going to be, Katrina was not going to be the last of the disasters. Hurricane Sandy and future disasters are going to come, and so we're only going to better respond and recover as we feed into this living framework. But again, the task force, the president signed off to identify and work to remove obstacles to resilient rebuilding in a manner that addresses existing and future risk and vulnerabilities. So here you see, we're kind of seeing the same takeaways from the New York State 2100 report, reducing vulnerabilities, encouraging resilient behaviors, and then once again here, removing obstacles in a manner that addresses existing future risks and vulnerabilities. It's probably a good point to take a step back and just quickly inform of the emergency relief programs that we have at the department. There is the Federal Highways emergency relief program that was established in the early 80s. Literally $100 million annually is authorized to this program. But to give you a sense of size and scope, you take a disaster such as Joplin, Missouri, where a tornado did about $2.7 billion worth of damage. So suddenly that $100 million to spread across disasters is a lot less. And that there serves the federal aid highways or roads on federal lands. So in the Sandy context, when Statue of Liberty or Liberty Island was hit, that's also going to receive some emergency relief. On the transit side, they set up their own program that was enacted in law, MAP 21, Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century, almost 2 years old, that law, but that program did not come with the same authorization that for funding that the highways program gets. So literally it was an unfunded program. Once the storm hit, you'll probably remember politicians were having a very long discussion about how and in what way recovery in the Sandy context should be funded. And to give a little bit of perspective, in Katrina, billions went out within 2 weeks or so of the storm's impact. I think it took until late January. So if you're doing the math, October to January is when they finally passed authorization and funding to rebuild the Sandy context. So this is the law. It's your Public Law 113-2. And they're citing some of the very same goals and provisions as we've seen before, providing assistance to surely timeliness and cost-effective completion of disaster assistance projects, coordination, which is very important, between federal, local, state partners. But then again, this last one here, I do want to point to, which is work with these partners to provide recommendations for reducing vulnerabilities to future disasters and reduce costs and impacts stemming from these disasters. So once again, the theme that we're seeing is now actually embedded in law. So you're getting a presidential executive order, there's consensus at the state level, and now at the congressional level. Authorization, the actual funds that were put forward, that were enacted into PL 113-2, originally $13 billion was authorized to the department across 4 modes, minus sequestration. The breakdown, it was FTA, 10.3 billion, highways almost 2 billion, FRA, Federal Railroad, 12 million, excuse me. Aviation, 28.5 million. And of course, there's going to be a lot of oversight associated with the use of these funds. So the Office of Inspector General, almost $6 million to make sure that we are spending it correctly. Annually, the department puts together, it's a climate change adaptation plan. And we revise this every year. As part of our most recent revision, and it's going through another one as we speak, DOT shall integrate consideration of climate change impacts and adaptation into planning, operations, policies, programs. What this means is we are to take a very close look at our programs in the highways mode, our programs in the transit mode, and to see where appropriately we are able to embed consideration of climate change impacts, whether it's in your policies, your operations, your process, and your planning. Also, as part of the climate change adaptation plan, these are the principles that guide us, adopting integrated approaches, which I think you've actually seen done well in the Sandy context, prioritizing the most vulnerable of infrastructure. And then this third one here is probably the most referred to in the Sandy context, is the use of best available science or data. Speaking here at Volpe, I think you all can appreciate that using not just appropriate but accurate data to incorporate into how we rebuild. In this instance, in the Northeast, using advisory-based floodplain maps, how that will inform how we rebuild, as well as applying risk management methods and tools, and then always constantly, continuously evaluating performance. In addition, there's an executive order that exists on floodplains, as well as DOT's own internal order. I mentioned before the ABFE, we call it the advisory-based floodplain elevations. These were flood maps used in the Northeast that determine where the flooding can move to inland. And as a policy, what we did at the interagency level was came to an agreement on how the rebuilding would be done using the authorized funds. And so in this instance here, ordinarily floodplain elevation maps by FEMA are formalized through a process. And as you can imagine, it can be a fairly political process. And in this instance, what we wanted to do was expedite that process so that the rebuilding on the ground could happen as soon as possible. So rather than wait for that process to formalize, we used the advisory-based floodplain elevation plus 1 foot to protect from future sea level rise. And again, this applies this standard to all the federally funded Sandy recovery projects. So incorporating resiliency into our programs. Well, taking a step back, there is, as I just mentioned, the interagency use of ABFE plus 1. Within the Office of the Secretary, we are, as appropriate, embedding this into our programs such as Tiger, where in a state of good repair, improving conditions, existing transportation facilities and systems. As you can illustrate that to us through the Tiger application process, that's something that we will weigh and consider as we're evaluating these applications. Environmental sustainability as well, improving resilience of transportation assets. So here you're starting to see where it is that we are kind of putting our money where our mouth is. And we're not just saying or suggesting you should build at a higher standard. What we're saying is here are actual criteria that we will evaluate when we give out our awards on the discretionary side. FAA is already incorporating these elevated provisions into their rebuilding efforts, and major rail projects on the Hudson River side. There are tunnels that are being built, one in particular that will provide redundancy, but that's also incorporating a lot of these rebuilding practices now. This just illustrates how also, getting a little bit more into the weeds, Federal Highways is incorporating or integrating climate resilience considerations into their programs and guidance and their policies. They've issued a memo that directs including some of this into vulnerability assessments and how they design for construction projects. They've also revised their emergency relief manual, which is now modernized to incorporate resilient approaches. The FTA, on their own discretionary side here, is incorporating resilient rebuilding into their notices for funding. They've actually put $3 billion out for funding on a competitive basis to rebuild some of these really massive projects in the region. But they too are also embedding resiliency into their programs. So what does this all mean? And I think ultimately the government wants to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So where able and appropriate, conducting a cost-benefit analysis is highly emphasized in how we put out our guidance now. FTA is evaluating quantitative measures, qualitative information related to system performance when it comes to resiliency. And one thing that we've learned all too well in this process is that if you build something at the same exact standard over and over, you're pretty much going to get the same result. And so if we are approaching this as an investment, think of it as weatherproofing your deck in more of the micro. We're just going to be putting money, throwing good money after bad if we continue to build these things the same way. I talked a little bit about risk assessments and likelihood of severity, how that relates to risks, and how we want to incorporate this into some of the thinking as well. And then finally, just the results, how have we done? Purely if you measure it in terms of that $10 plus billion, say in the transit system, we've allocated about $7.8 billion of that now. We operate on a reimbursement basis, so we actually, as part of the transparency process, we want to know what it is that we're actually paying for. And so we will sometimes hear our share of criticism as to getting all of the funding out, but we want to make sure that the rebuilding is being done the correct way. And here are some of the resources that we're all relying on for this. But I think to summarize, again, we want to rebuild in ways that are smarter. We want to invest taxpayer dollars and stretch every dollar in this more austere environment where we're not sure if, where the next budget's going to come from. We're not sure how the next project's going to be funded. But with that, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, thank you.